They thought they buried the truth with his father, but his dog uncovered what could destroy them all. His stepmother took everything from a Navy SEAL. His German Shepherd found what she hid for years. On a frozen Montana morning, Jack Mercer stood silent as his inheritance vanished with the reading of a will. No anger, no protest. Just the cold wind and his loyal German Shepherd at his side. But beneath the ashes of a burned barn and the quiet of a snow-covered field, something waited. Something his dog refused to ignore. Comment 1 if you'd fight for your family's land, or 0 if you'd walk away. And tell us where you're watching from. The morning sky over the Bitterroot Valley was the color of cold steel. Frost clung to the fence rails, silver and fragile, and the cattle in the lower pasture stood in tight clusters, steam rising from their backs like faint signals in the still air. The mountains beyond the ranch were capped in white, their ridgelines sharp against a sky that had not yet decided whether it would snow again. Jack Mercer stood on the wide wooden porch of the ranch house where he had grown up, boots planted shoulder-width apart, hands loose at his sides. He wore a faded canvas jacket, the kind built for hard weather, and beneath it a flannel shirt buttoned to his throat. His breath came slow and controlled, visible in pale clouds that disappeared almost as soon as they formed. At his side sat Atlas. The German Shepherd's black and tan coat looked almost polished in the winter light. His ears were upright, his posture alert but calm, eyes tracking every small movement around them. He did not fidget. He did not whine. He waited. Across from them, near the porch railing, Edgar Whitmore cleared his throat. The attorney was dressed in a charcoal overcoat that seemed out of place against the raw timber of the ranch house. A leather folder rested in his gloved hands. He looked like a man accustomed to quiet rooms and polished floors, not frozen wood and open land. Caroline Mercer stood slightly behind him. She wore a long camel-colored coat and dark gloves, her blonde hair swept neatly behind her shoulders. Even in the cold, her expression was composed, not grief-stricken, not shaken, just prepared. Whitmore adjusted his glasses and began to read. Pursuant to the final and legally binding will of Thomas Mercer, he said evenly, all primary real property, including the residence located at 1185 Hollow Ridge Road, the cattle holdings, agricultural equipment, mineral rights, and associated investment accounts, are hereby transferred in full to Caroline Mercer. The words hung in the air, heavier than the frost. Jack did not move. He had known, at least in part, that this was coming. In the last year of his father's life, phone calls had grown shorter. Visits had been postponed. Decisions had been made without him. Still, hearing it laid out so plainly was like feeling a door close with finality. Whitmore continued. To Jack Mercer, son of the deceased, the testator bequeaths parcel designation 42C, consisting of the North Irrigation Field and adjacent structure across the Bitterroot River. Additionally, the 2006 Ford pickup currently titled in the testator's name. A pause. That concludes the distribution of assets. The wind moved across the porch, carrying the faint scent of hay and distant wood smoke. Jack's jaw tightened, just slightly. The North Irrigation Field, the abandoned barn, land no one had used in years because the pump system had failed and the soil had turned hard. It was the part of the ranch his father used to call dead ground. Behind him, one of the ranch hands shifted uncomfortably. A neighbor from down the valley coughed into his scarf. No one spoke. Carolyn stepped forward, heels clicking softly against the porch boards. Well, she said, her voice light, almost conversational. I suppose that settles things. She looked at Jack then. Not long, just enough. There was something in her eyes that wasn't sorrow. It wasn't even triumph. It was relief. Atlas's ears twitched. The dog rose smoothly to his feet and stepped half a pace in front of Jack, positioning himself between Jack and Caroline. A low, controlled growl vibrated in his chest. Quiet, but unmistakable. Whitmore glanced down at the dog. "Mr. Mercer," he said stiffly, "please control." "It's all right," Jack murmured. He placed a steady hand on Atlas's shoulder. The pressure was firm but gentle. Atlas did not take his eyes off Caroline. For a heartbeat, something flickered across her face. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. "Your dog has always been intense," she said, smoothing a gloved hand over her coat sleeve. "He reads people," Jack replied. The words were simple, flat. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. Whitmore closed the folder with a soft snap. "If there are no objections," he said, "this matter is concluded." Objections. Jack almost smiled at that. He had learned, years ago in places most people couldn't point to on a map, that shouting did not win battles. Reaction gave away position. Emotion created openings. He said nothing. Instead, he looked past Caroline, past Whitmore, at the house itself. The timber walls were darker than he remembered. The porch swing on the far end creaked slightly in the wind. That swing had once held him and his father on late summer nights, when the sky glowed orange over the valley and cattle bells rang softly in the distance. His father had been a quiet man, not cold, just careful. He had taught Jack how to mend fences, how to read the weather by the way clouds formed over the ridge, how to tell when cattle were uneasy long before they stampeded. But in the last year, something had shifted. Phone calls cut short. Medical appointments he wasn't told about. Paperwork handled by Whitmore instead of conversations with his own son. Jack had been overseas for most of his adult life. 12 years as a Navy SEAL. Deployments layered one over another. Missions that required silence, precision, and a willingness to accept that not everyone came home. He had come home. But not all of him. Even now, standing on the porch, the crack of a distant branch in the pasture made his shoulders tense. His breath paused before resuming its slow rhythm. He forced himself to loosen his hands, to unclench his fingers. Atlas felt it instantly. The dog shifted closer, brushing his side against Jack's leg, grounding him. Jack inhaled deeply through his nose. Bitter cold air. Pine. Hay. "I'll be off the property by sundown," he said finally. Carolyn blinked, as if she had expected more. An argument. A threat. Something messy she could point to later. "That would be best," she replied. Whitmore nodded. "I'll have documentation drawn up regarding transfer of access to the remaining equipment." Jack didn't answer. He turned, boots thudding softly on the porch boards, and walked down the steps toward the gravel drive. Atlas followed at heel, perfectly aligned, never looking back. Behind him, he heard Caroline exhale, a sound of release. Halfway down the drive, Jack paused. Across the valley, beyond the thin ribbon of the Bitterroot River, he could see the outline of the north field. Snow lay uneven across it, and the old red barn leaned slightly to one side like a tired soldier refusing to fall. Dead ground. His father's words echoed faintly in his memory. Atlas stopped beside him and lifted his head. The dog's posture changed, subtle, but distinct. Ears forward, body still, eyes fixed not on the ranch house but on the distant barn across the river. Jack followed his gaze. The barn door, from this distance, was barely a darker rectangle against faded red wood. A strange feeling crept into his chest. Not grief, not anger. Something else. As if something unfinished waited there. Atlas let out a single, low huff. Jack rested a hand on the dog's neck. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go see what he left me." The wind shifted again, sweeping down from the mountains and across the valley floor. Behind them, the ranch house stood solid and claimed. Ahead of them, the field no one wanted lay silent beneath the winter sky. Jack Mercer did not look back. The drive down to the river was narrow and rutted, the truck's tires crunching over frozen gravel and patches of old ice. The Ford pickup rattled in familiar ways, engine humming low and steady, like it had something to prove. Jack kept both hands on the wheel, posture straight, eyes scanning the tree line without consciously meaning to. Atlas sat in the passenger seat, front paws planted wide, head slightly lowered, watching the world pass through the windshield. He didn't pant, didn't shift. He studied. The river crossing was an old steel bridge built decades ago for ranch traffic. Its beams were painted a faded green, flaking in places where rust had begun to show through. As the truck rolled across, the metal groaned softly beneath the weight. The sound hit Jack like a distant echo. For half a second, the groan became something else, a memory of aircraft hulls under strain, of cargo doors opening in desert winds. His chest tightened. His fingers flexed on the wheel. He blinked once, sharply, forcing the present back into place. Montana. Bitterroot Valley. Snow. River. Atlas's nose nudged lightly against his thigh. Jack exhaled slowly. "I'm good," he muttered. The north field came into full view as they crossed the bridge. It was larger than he remembered, stretching unevenly toward the base of a low pine-covered ridge. Snow lay in shallow drifts along broken fence lines. The irrigation channels were cracked and dry, their wooden gates sagging. At the far end stood the barn. The red paint had faded to a tired brown. One side leaned slightly inward. The main door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Dead ground. Jack parked the truck near the fence and stepped out into the cold. The air felt different here. Quieter, more isolated. The ranch house across the river seemed miles away, though it was only a few hundred yards. Atlas jumped down beside him, paws landing lightly in the snow. He stood still for a moment, scanning the open field. Then, without waiting for a command, he started toward the barn. "Easy," Jack called. Atlas didn't run. He walked with purpose. Jack followed, boots crunching with each step. The silence pressed in around them. No cattle sounds. No windmills turning. Just the distant rush of the river behind them, and the faint cry of a hawk somewhere overhead. As they approached, the barn's details sharpened. Boards warped with age, nails protruding slightly from swollen wood. A chain looped loosely through the door handles, though it wasn't locked. Jack stopped a few feet away. The barn smelled faintly of old hay and cold dust. He reached out and pushed the door open. It groaned wide, revealing a dim interior washed in pale winter light filtering through gaps in the siding. Inside, broken tools lay scattered near one wall. A rusted tractor tire leaned against a support beam. Hay bales, long since rotted, sat collapsed in corners. The place felt forgotten. Atlas stepped in first. His paws moved softly across the wooden floor. He paused near the center of the barn and lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Jack stood at the threshold longer than he meant to. The darkness inside shifted in his mind. For a brief second, the smell of hay turned into dust and cordite. The narrow beams of light cutting through cracks in the walls became slivers of daylight in concrete ruins. His pulse picked up. He swallowed hard. "You've cleared worse," he murmured to himself. Atlas glanced back at him, waiting. Jack forced his feet forward. The boards creaked under his weight. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet. He scanned the rafters automatically, eyes checking for movement, for instability. It was just a barn. Just wood and nails and time. Atlas moved toward the far right corner. He stopped. His body stiffened, not in fear, but in focus. His ears tilted forward, and his nose dropped toward the floor. Jack watched him carefully. "What is it?" Atlas began sniffing in a tight circle near a support beam, where the floorboards looked darker than the rest. He pawed once at the wood. The sound was hollow. Jack frowned. He crouched down and ran his gloved hand over the boards. They were worn and uneven, but beneath the surface there was a subtle firmness that didn't match the rot around it. He tapped lightly with his knuckles. Solid. Then a few inches over. Different. Atlas scratched again, more insistently. "All right," Jack said quietly. He stood and walked back to the truck, retrieving a small pry bar from the toolkit behind the seat. When he returned, Atlas hadn't moved from the spot. Jack knelt again and wedged the bar into a seam between two boards. The wood splintered easily. Too easily. He pulled one plank free. Beneath it wasn't dirt. It was concrete. Jack froze. Concrete had no business being under a ranch barn floor from 50 years ago. This barn had been built by his grandfather with timber and hand tools. No one poured reinforced slabs under feed storage. Atlas let out a low sound in his throat. Jack cleared away more boards, revealing a rectangular section of smooth concrete fitted flush with the rest of the barn floor. Along one edge ran a faint seam almost invisible unless you were looking for it. His heartbeat slowed, not faster. Training took over. Deliberate construction beneath decay. He brushed snow-damp sawdust away from the seam. There. Metal. A narrow strip of steel embedded in the concrete. "This wasn't here before," Jack whispered. Atlas stood directly beside him now, eyes locked on the hidden edge. Jack ran his hand over the surface. It was cold, but not cracked. Whoever had poured this had known what they were doing. The concrete was newer than the barn around it. Maybe 10 years old, maybe less. His father had never mentioned renovations. He sat back on his heels, mind turning. Why hide something here? Why give him this land? A thin thread of suspicion slid into place. Across the river, he could just make out the roof of the main ranch house through the trees. Had Caroline known? Had his father? Atlas suddenly moved toward the barn door. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stood there, staring out into the field. Jack rose slowly and followed his line of sight. The field was empty, yet something felt off. The valley had a certain rhythm, wind through pine, distant cattle, water against stone. But now it felt paused, watching. Jack stepped to the doorway and scanned the tree line near the riverbank. Nothing moved. He looked back at the concrete slab. Whatever was under there wasn't accidental, and it wasn't meant to be found by someone casually clearing out old wood. It was meant to survive. Atlas returned to his side, pressing his shoulder lightly against Jack's knee. Jack rested his hand on the dog's head. "You picked this," he said softly. Atlas's tail gave a single, slow sweep. Jack stood and looked around the barn once more. The broken tools, the sagging beams, the false decay, dead ground, or camouflage. The wind outside picked up, pushing a small swirl of snow through the open doorway. It drifted across the barn floor and settled along the edge of the hidden concrete. Jack's gaze hardened. Whatever his father had done here, it wasn't random. And whatever Caroline thought she had taken from him, she might not have understood what had been left behind. "All right," Jack murmured, eyes fixed on the seam in the slab. "Let's see what he didn't want them to find." Atlas stepped closer, standing ready. The field no one wanted no longer felt abandoned. It felt guarded. Jack stood in the center of the barn, the cold light slanting through warped boards and casting long, uneven shadows across the concrete slab at his feet. Snow hissed faintly along the doorway as the wind shifted outside. The entire valley seemed to be holding its breath. Atlas stood close, not pacing now, not searching, waiting. Jack crouched again and traced the thin steel seam embedded in the concrete. It formed a clean rectangle beneath the splintered boards he had already pulled free. Whoever had built this had taken time to disguise it beneath decay. "Concrete under a wooden barn," Jack muttered. "That's not accidental." He pressed his palm flat against the slab. Cold, solid. But near the steel strip, just a faint difference. A subtle give when he leaned his weight. Atlas leaned forward and sniffed along the seam, then lifted his head and looked directly at Jack. His ears were forward, his eyes steady, not anxious, certain. Jack reached for the pry bar again. He wedged it carefully under the steel lip and applied slow, controlled pressure. The metal resisted at first. He adjusted his angle and pulled again. A low grinding sound echoed through the barn. His pulse slowed further, dropping into the steady rhythm that used to carry him through tight spaces overseas. Breathe in, count. Breathe out. The slab shifted, barely an inch. A faint line of darkness appeared beneath it. Atlas stiffened. Jack paused. He listened. Only wind. Only the faint creak of wood overhead. He slid his fingers into the gap and pulled. The slab rose on hidden hinges, heavy but balanced. Beneath it, a narrow stairwell descended into shadow. Jack's breath caught, not in panic, but in recognition. Tight space, unknown structure, limited visibility. The scent drifting up wasn't rot or mold. It was dry, clean, controlled. Atlas stepped closer to the edge and peered down without hesitation. Jack swallowed once. The stairwell was reinforced with concrete walls, poured clean and straight. A faint metal handrail ran along one side. At the bottom, a small platform opened into what looked like a larger room. "This wasn't thrown together," Jack whispered. Atlas glanced at him, then stepped onto the first stair. Easy. But Atlas didn't rush. He descended one step at a time, pause deliberate, body balanced. Jack followed. The temperature dropped as they moved lower. The barn sounds faded behind them, replaced by a muted stillness that felt insulated from the world above. Halfway down, Jack felt the old pressure building in his chest. The memory came uninvited. A tunnel carved into Afghan rock, dust thick in his lungs, radio static crackling in his ear. The walls had felt too close, the air too thin. His hand tightened on the rail. Atlas stopped on the stair below him. He turned and pressed his shoulder gently against Jack's knee. The contact broke the memory's grip. Jack exhaled slowly. "I'm here," he murmured. Not to the dog, but to himself, Montana. Concrete stairs. Barn overhead. He forced his focus forward. At the bottom, the stairwell opened into a chamber roughly the size of a two-car garage. The walls were reinforced concrete, smooth and carefully poured. LED strip lights were mounted along the ceiling. Off now, but wired cleanly. A small electrical panel sat near one wall. Jack's eyes scanned automatically. No signs of forced entry. No dust piles from recent disturbance. The air was stale but not suffocating. Against the far wall sat 3 large, sealed plastic containers stacked neatly. Beside them, metal file boxes. A heavy desk stood near the center of the room, bolted to the floor. Atlas stepped off the final stair and moved slowly across the concrete. His tail was level, his posture alert. Jack followed, boots echoing faintly. He approached the desk first. On its surface lay a stack of folders bound with thick rubber bands. A small, portable battery pack rested beside them. Everything was arranged with precision, not abandoned, not chaotic. He picked up the top folder. His father's name was typed neatly across the tab, Thomas Mercer. Jack opened it. Inside were medical records, his father's final year, appointment dates, medication lists, dosage changes. Jack's jaw tightened. He flipped through the pages more quickly now. Blood pressure stable, heart condition noted but not critical. Then, sudden escalation. New prescriptions introduced within weeks, adjustments marked as urgent, handwritten notes in the margins from Dr. Avery Collins. Jack slowed. He remembered those last months. His father's voice sounding weaker on the phone. Shortness of breath that came out of nowhere. He went downhill too fast, Jack whispered. Atlas moved toward the stacked containers. He sniffed along the edges, then nudged one lightly with his nose. Jack set the folder down and joined him. The container lids were sealed but not locked. He opened the first one. Inside were more documents. Financial statements this time. Large transfers, account closures, property reassignments, each dated within 6 months of his father's death. Jack felt heat rising in his chest now. Not panic. Anger. But controlled. He scanned the signatures. Edgar Whitmore's name appeared repeatedly. Legal oversight. Estate restructuring. Insurance policies initiated shortly before hospitalization. Jack's eyes narrowed. Insurance, he muttered. Atlas shifted suddenly. He moved toward a metal cabinet in the corner and pawed at its lower door. Jack crossed the room. The cabinet door was latched. He opened it. Inside sat a small digital voice recorder, old-fashioned, simple. Atlas stared at it without blinking. Jack picked it up slowly. The plastic casing was scratched, but intact. A small label on the back read only one word in faded ink. T.M. Thomas Mercer. Jack's thumb hovered over the play button. His pulse ticked upward again. Not from fear this time. From anticipation. He pressed play. Static crackled softly in the quiet chamber. Then, his father's voice, weak but unmistakable. "If you're hearing this," Thomas Mercer said slowly, "then you found the barn." Jack closed his eyes briefly. Atlas stood perfectly still beside him. "I didn't have much time once I understood what was happening," the voice continued. "Changes were made without my consent. Papers signed while I was sedated. Adjustments to medication I never agreed to." Jack's fingers tightened around the recorder. "Caroline believes control is safety. Whitmore believes paperwork erases questions. They are wrong." A faint cough echoed through the speaker. "If I'm gone before you see this, it wasn't natural. Not entirely. Check the transfers. Check the policies." Static hissed. I couldn't confront them directly, but I could move things, hide what mattered, trust what they overlooked. A pause. The land across the river. The recording ended. Silence fell heavy in the chamber. Jack stood unmoving, the recorder still in his hand. Atlas looked up at him. Jack's expression had changed. The humiliation on the porch was gone. The quiet suspicion in the barn had sharpened. Now there was something colder. Clarity. They thought I was too far away, he said softly. Atlas's tail flicked once. Jack walked back to the desk and spread the documents across its surface. Transfers. Insurance policies. Medical changes. Whitmore's signatures. Dr. Collins's adjustments. The pattern wasn't random. It was systematic. Outside, the wind rose slightly, brushing against the barn overhead. A faint thump echoed down through the stairwell, just loose wood shifting in the cold. But down here, beneath the rotten boards, everything was intact, protected. Jack looked toward the stairwell. They gave me the dead ground, he said quietly. Atlas stood at his side, steady and silent. They didn't realize it was the only place he trusted. The chamber didn't feel like a hiding spot anymore. It felt like evidence. And for the first time since standing on that frozen porch, Jack Mercer felt something other than loss. He felt purpose. The underground chamber no longer seemed like a relic of fear. It felt like a map. Jack gathered the folders into neat stacks across the desk, organizing them by date. Atlas remained near the stairwell, head tilted slightly upward, listening to the world above while never fondly turning his back on Jack. "Okay," Jack murmured, more to steady his own thoughts than to fill the silence. "Let's walk this back." He opened the medical file again and laid it flat under the cold LED glow of his phone's flashlight. The early pages showed routine visits, blood pressure stable, mild arrhythmia monitored, no signs of rapid decline. Then, 3 months before Thomas Mercer's death, something shifted. Medication. A discontinued. Medication B introduced at elevated dosage. Within 2 weeks, additional sedatives prescribed for restlessness. Jack's jaw tightened. His father had never been restless. He had been stubborn, yes. Sharp, quiet, but not confused, not agitated. Jack flipped to the notes page signed by Dr. Avery Collins. "Patient exhibiting increased anxiety and resistance to treatment," the note read. "Dosage adjusted for patient comfort." Comfort. Jack's pulse began to rise again. Not in panic, but in anger held tightly in place. He remembered the last time he had visited his father in the small white house at the edge of town, where Caroline insisted he stay for ease of care. His father had seemed tired, slower to speak, but when Jack leaned close, the old man had gripped his wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Watch the paper, son." At the time, Jack had thought it was about land surveys or cattle contracts. Now he understood. Atlas shifted behind him. Jack turned his head. The dog had moved toward the metal cabinets lining the far wall. He nudged one gently with his nose, then scratched at its lower corner. "Already checked that one," Jack said softly. Atlas scratched again, more precisely this time. Jack stood and crossed the room. He opened the cabinet door fully and ran his hand along the back panel. Smooth metal, no shelves beyond the visible ones. Atlas pressed his nose against the right side and let out a short, low sound. Jack crouched and tapped the metal. Solid. He moved 2 inches to the left. Different. A hollow echo. Jack exhaled slowly. Good boy. He wedged the pry bar carefully between the panel seam and applied controlled pressure. The metal bent slightly before popping free with a dull snap. Behind it was a narrow compartment. Inside sat a small waterproof case. Jack removed it and placed it on the desk. Atlas followed closely, eyes never leaving the object. The case clicked open. Inside lay a flash drive and another thin folder marked in his father's handwriting. If the pattern repeats. Jack felt a chill move up his spine. He opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of estate records, not just his father's. Names from neighboring counties, older ranchers, widows, properties transferred to Carolyn Mercer through complex joint filings. Whitmore's signature appeared again and again as overseeing counsel. Jack's breathing grew shallow, but controlled. "This isn't just about us," he said quietly. Atlas's ears flicked at the tone. Jack inserted the flash drive into the small, battery-powered laptop he found in one of the containers. The screen flickered to life, casting pale light across the concrete walls. Folders appeared on the screen. Bank transfers, property deeds, audio recordings. He opened one labeled Conversation, May. Static crackled. Caroline's voice filled the chamber. "We don't have another year," she said sharply. "He's questioning the revisions." A second voice responded, male, calm, measured. "Then adjustments need to be accelerated," Edgar Whitmore said. "Legally, everything remains within compliance." "Legally," Carolyn replied. "But if Jack comes back and starts asking questions—" "He won't," Whitmore interrupted. "He's a soldier. Soldiers leave." The recording ended abruptly. Jack stared at the screen. His chest felt tight again, but this time not from claustrophobia, from betrayal. Atlas stepped closer, pressing his body lightly against Jack's leg. The contact was steady, grounding. Jack reached down and rested his hand on the dog's neck. "They underestimated you," he said softly. Atlas's tail moved once. Jack opened another audio file. His father's voice again, this one weaker. "I agreed to some changes because I thought they were temporary," Thomas Mercer said. "But they increased the dosage without explanation. I feel foggy, slower, a cough. If something happens suddenly, it won't be my heart alone." The file cut out. Jack shut the laptop slowly. The silence in the chamber now felt heavier than before. He leaned back against the desk and closed his eyes. Images flashed. Not from combat this time, but from hospital corridors. The day he had arrived too late. Caroline standing near the bed, face composed, saying it had been peaceful, quick, inevitable. His fists tightened. Atlas let out a low rumble, not at anything visible, but in response to the shift in Jack's body. Jack inhaled deeply through his nose and forced his hands open. "Not anger," he murmured to himself. "Clarity." He looked at the files again. Medication manipulation. Insurance policies taken out weeks before hospitalization. Multiple estate transfers under Whitmore's counsel. This wasn't grief-driven confusion. It was orchestration. Atlas suddenly lifted his head sharply. His ears snapped toward the stairwell. Jack turned instantly. "What is it?" Atlas's posture changed. Not aggressive, but alert. Focused on the ceiling above them. Jack held his breath. A faint sound filtered down through the barn floor overhead. A soft thud. Then another. Not wind. Not settling wood. Footsteps. Jack moved toward the base of the stairs silently. Atlas stepped in front of him this time. The footsteps paused. Jack glanced at the LED panel overhead and switched it off. Darkness swallowed the chamber except for the faint glow of his phone. The footsteps resumed, slower now, deliberate. Jack's mind calculated distance, entry point, escape routes. He whispered, "Stay." Atlas did not move. The sound above them shifted toward the center of the barn, directly over the trapdoor. Jack's pulse slowed into combat rhythm. Then, a scrape. Metal against wood. Jack looked up sharply. Someone was dragging something across the barn floor. Atlas let out a low growl, quiet but intense. Jack's jaw hardened. They hadn't waited long. Whatever Caroline and Whitmore had assumed about him being passive ended the moment he crossed that bridge. He reached down and switched off his phone light entirely. The chamber went black. Above them, a final sound echoed. The unmistakable click of a lock being fastened from the outside. Jack's breath steadied. They weren't just watching. They were moving. And now he knew something else. His father hadn't just suspected. He had been right. And whatever had killed him hadn't ended with his funeral. Above them, the lock clicked into place with quiet finality. Jack stood in complete darkness, one hand resting lightly on Atlas's back. He could feel the dog's muscles coiled beneath his palm, not panicked, not confused. Ready. The stairwell ceiling creaked faintly. Then came a new smell. At first it was subtle, faint, out of place, smoke. Atlas reacted before Jack consciously processed it. The dog's head snapped upward, nostrils flaring. A low, urgent growl vibrated in his chest. Jack inhaled deeply. Yes. Smoke. Not drifting in from a distant chimney. Thicker. Closer. "They locked us in," Jack whispered. "And now they're trying to bury it." He moved quickly but without wasted motion. Training replaced shock. He switched the LED panel back on. Pale light flooded the chamber again. "Exit," he murmured. Atlas pivoted toward the far side of the room, nose already scanning low. The first thin ribbon of smoke began to snake down the stairwell. Jack grabbed the laptop, the flash drive, and the most critical folders, stuffing them into his pack with practiced speed. He slid the voice recorder into an inside pocket. Above, something heavy thudded against the barn floor. Then a crackling sound. Flames. The stairwell began to fill with gray haze. Jack sprinted to the bottom of the steps and tested the hatch. Locked tight. He shoved upward anyway. Solid resistance. Atlas barked once, sharp, commanding. Not fear. Direction. "Where?" Jack demanded. Atlas bolted across the room to the far corner behind a stack of old hay bales that had been stored inside the chamber itself. The hay was dry but clean, not decayed like the barn above. Atlas clawed at the concrete wall beside it. Jack ran to him. The smoke was thickening now, curling downward in layers. Atlas dug frantically, not randomly, but at a precise point near the base of the wall. Jack dropped to one knee and pressed his ear against the surface. A faint draft. Cold air. "There," he said. He shoved the hay aside and saw it. A narrow rectangular outline cut into the concrete, nearly invisible unless you were searching for it. His father had built redundancy. Jack wedged the pry bar into the seam. The smoke rolled lower, stinging his eyes. Above them, the roar intensified, wood beams snapping, flames devouring old boards soaked in decades of dust. "Come on," he muttered. The panel gave with a sharp crack. Behind it was a narrow culvert, barely 3 feet high and just wide enough for a man to crawl through. The concrete sloped slightly downward. Cold air rushed in. Atlas didn't hesitate. He lowered himself and crawled inside. Jack followed, dragging his pack behind him. Behind them, the chamber began to fill rapidly with smoke. The roar above turned violent. A section of the barn roof collapsed with a thunderous crash. Jack crawled forward, elbows scraping against cold concrete. The space was tight, too tight. His breathing quickened. The tunnel walls seemed to close in. For half a second, Afghanistan came back hard and sharp, dust collapsing in a mountain pass, radio chatter lost in static, the feeling of earth pressing in from every side. His vision blurred. Atlas stopped in front of him and turned. In the confined space, the dog's eyes locked onto his. Steady, present. Jack forced air into his lungs. Montana. River. Atlas. He nodded once. "I'm good," he whispered. Atlas turned and continued forward. The tunnel curved slightly and widened by a few inches. Cold water began to seep across the floor. Then light. A faint, pale shimmer ahead. Atlas pushed through first. Jack crawled after him and felt icy water soak through his gloves. They emerged from a low opening in the riverbank just beneath the bridge. Jack rolled onto his back, gulping air. Atlas stood over him, barking once, loud and sharp. Behind them, flames leapt into the winter sky. The barn burned like a torch. Black smoke twisted upward against the white mountains. Jack staggered to his feet. Across the open field, near the edge of the trees, a black SUV sat parked with its engine running. A man stood beside it. Tall, broad shoulders, hands tucked into a dark jacket. Even from this distance, Jack could see the posture. Casual but intentional. Travis Doyle, former deputy. Now, apparently, something else. Doyle watched the fire without urgency, watched the barn collapse inward, watched the river. For a brief moment, his eyes locked with Jack's. No surprise, no fear, just acknowledgement. Then Doyle climbed into the SUV and drove off, tires spitting gravel. Jack stood there, chest heaving in the cold. Atlas moved beside him, scanning the tree line, ears high. Sirens began to wail faintly in the distance. Jack's pulse shifted. The sound triggered something deep. Sirens meant patrols, debriefings, lights, questions. He felt the edges of his control fraying. Atlas pressed firmly against his thigh. Grounding. Jack forced himself to focus. The barn was gone, but the evidence was in his pack. And the fact that someone had moved this quickly meant one thing. They were afraid. A pickup truck skidded to a stop on the bridge above them. A woman jumped out, boots crunching over ice as she hurried down the embankment. "Hey!" she shouted. "Are you hurt?" Jack turned. Megan Lawson. He recognized her from town, a neighboring rancher who also worked part-time as an EMT. She slid down the riverbank and grabbed his arm, checking his pupils automatically. "You're breathing smoke," she said. "Sit down." "I'm fine," Jack replied, voice hoarse. Atlas stepped between Megan and Jack briefly, growling low. "It's okay," Jack murmured. Atlas backed down but didn't move far. Megan glanced at the dog. "He saved you?" Jack nodded once. She looked toward the burning barn. "That wasn't an accident." "No," Jack said quietly. Snowflakes began to drift down through the smoke, hissing as they touched the flames. Fire trucks roared across the bridge. Jack watched them approach without emotion. The humiliation on the porch was gone. The suspicion in the barn had become proof. And now, this. They had tried to erase the evidence. Instead, they had confirmed it. Megan wrapped a thermal blanket around his shoulders, despite his protest. "You're shaking," she said. "I'm not." But he was. Not from cold. From the realization that the game had moved forward. Atlas stepped close, leaning his full weight against Jack's leg. The dog's fur was damp from the river, streaked with ash. Jack placed a steady hand on his head. They thought they could end it with a match, Jack said quietly, eyes fixed on the burning structure. The roof caved in fully, sending a shower of sparks into the gray sky. But they just made it personal. The barn collapsed into itself, flames devouring the last standing beams. Snow continued to fall, and in the reflection of the firelight dancing in Atlas's dark eyes, Jack Mercer felt something shift inside him. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was engaged. The fire crews worked through the afternoon, hoses arcing in silver streams against the collapsing skeleton of the barn. Steam rose where water met flame, drifting low across the snow like fog crawling over a battlefield after the noise had stopped. Jack sat on the tailgate of Megan Lawson's ranch truck, a wool blanket wrapped loosely around his shoulders. Atlas stood pressed against his leg, still damp, still streaked with ash, but upright and alert. "You need oxygen," Megan said firmly, kneeling in front of him with a portable tank. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone used to chaos. "You inhaled smoke. Don't argue with me." Jack didn't. He leaned forward slightly as she placed the mask over his face. The cold air hissed softly. His breathing steadied. Atlas watched Megan carefully, ears angled forward, eyes calculating. "He won't let anyone close if you start drifting," Megan observed quietly. "I'm not drifting," Jack replied. But his hands trembled faintly. The sirens, the crackle of fire, the sharp radio chatter from firefighters, it all overlapped in his mind with older sounds. Helicopter rotors, command voices, the metallic scent of burned insulation. For a moment, he wasn't on the riverbank. He was back in a concrete compound overseas, smoke rolling through broken corridors. Atlas shifted his weight and leaned harder into him. Jack blinked hard and focused on the river flowing steadily beneath the bridge. Cold water, Montana sky, snow. "I'm here," he said softly, almost to himself. Megan studied him for a second longer, then nodded. "Good," she said. "Stay that way." Across the field, the fire chief spoke with 2 county deputies. One of them glanced toward Jack. Jack met the look without flinching. He saw it in their posture already. This would be ruled accidental unless someone forced it otherwise. Old wiring, faulty heater, negligence. Doyle had known that. He had chosen fire because fire erased details. Megan stood and stepped closer to him. "That wasn't random," she said quietly. "You saw someone, didn't you?" Jack removed the oxygen mask. "Travis Doyle." Megan's expression tightened. "He used to patrol this valley, knows every back road." "He wanted me to see him," Jack replied. "He didn't try to hide." "Why?" Jack looked back at the smoking remains of the barn. "Message." Snow continued to fall lightly, settling on blackened beams and melting into gray water. Megan followed his gaze. "You think whoever did this knows what was down there?" Jack hesitated only a fraction of a second. "They know something was down there," he said. Megan's eyes sharpened. And they're worried I found it." The firefighters finally pulled back, declaring the structure fully lost. Only a smoldering frame remained, skeletal and fragile against the darkening sky. Jack slid off the tailgate. Atlas immediately aligned at his side. "You shouldn't move much tonight," Megan said. "You've been through smoke and freezing water." "I've been through worse. That's not the point," she replied gently. For a moment, something softer flickered across Jack's expression. I know. Megan studied him carefully. Where are you going to stay? She asked. Jack looked across the river toward the main ranch house. Lights were already glowing in the windows. Caroline would be inside, warm, safe, certain she had closed the chapter. I won't be there, Jack said quietly. Megan nodded. You can use my bunkhouse. It's heated, close enough for me to check on you. Jack hesitated. Pride tugged at him. Habit told him to disappear, to handle it alone. Atlas nudged his thigh. Jack glanced down at him. The dog's eyes were steady, unjudging. You always did hate help, Megan added with a faint smile. Jack almost smiled back. Just temporary, he said. Temporary's fine. By nightfall, the fire was nothing but smoke and embers glowing faintly under the snow. The valley returned to its quiet rhythm as if nothing had happened. Megan's ranch sat a mile up the road, tucked against a rise overlooking open pasture. The bunkhouse was small but warm, wood stove burning steady inside. Jack sat at the small table while Megan set down a mug of coffee in front of him. Atlas lay near the door, but not fully asleep. His head rested on his paws, ears twitching at every unfamiliar creak. You're not pressing charges? Megan asked. Not yet. Why? Jack removed the flash drive from his pocket and set it on the table. Because I don't want them defensive, he said. I want them comfortable. Megan studied the small piece of plastic as if it were something fragile and dangerous. What's on it? Enough to make them nervous. She leaned back in her chair. This is bigger than the barn, isn't it? Jack nodded slowly. It started before my father died. Megan's expression darkened. Jack. He shook his head. I need proof before I say it out loud. Silence settled between them, broken only by the steady crackle of the stove. After a few minutes, Megan stood. Rest, she said. I'll be up at 5. If you're still here, I'll make breakfast. Jack gave a short nod. When she left, the bunkhouse felt smaller, quieter. Atlas lifted his head and walked over, placing his chin gently on Jack's knee. Jack rested his hand on the dog's neck. They tried to bury it, he said softly. Atlas's tail thumped once against the wooden floor. Jack leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was fractured. He saw the barn burning again, heard Doyle's boots crunching in the snow, heard his father's voice from the recorder, calm but urgent. Watch the paper, son. Jack woke suddenly in the middle of the night, breath tight, heart pounding. Atlas was already upright. The dog placed his paws on Jack's chest gently and leaned in until Jack's breathing slowed. Outside, the wind moved across the valley. No sirens, no flames, just snow drifting over blackened ground. Jack sat up slowly and looked at Atlas. You pulled me through a tunnel, he said quietly. Again. Atlas blinked, steady. Jack stood and walked to the small window. Across the dark valley, he could just make out the faint glow of lights from the main ranch house. Caroline thought the barn had been the end. Doyle thought intimidation would push him away. They were wrong. Jack felt it clearly now. Not rage, not vengeance, strategy. They escalated, he murmured. Now I will. Atlas moved to stand beside him at the window. Two silhouettes against the Montana night. The river flowed unseen in the darkness between properties. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a black SUV drove slowly along an empty road, believing the job was half done. But in the bunkhouse above the valley, a former Navy SEAL and his loyal K-9 were no longer reacting to threats. They were planning. The next morning came quietly. A pale Montana sunrise stretched across the Bitterroot Valley, brushing the snow with soft gold. Smoke from the burned barn still lingered faintly in the distance, a gray scar against the white field. Jack stood outside the bunkhouse with a thermos in one hand, watching the valley wake up. Megan's ranch hands moved slowly across the pasture, checking fences. Life resumed as if fire and betrayal were just weather passing through. Atlas stood beside him, breath fogging in short bursts. 3 days, Jack said quietly. That's what we need. Atlas's ears tilted slightly. 3 days to disappear, not to run, to recalibrate. By mid-morning, Jack had packed only what was essential: documents, the flash drive, the recorder, and enough supplies for a short backcountry stay. He left the pickup under Megan's shed and chose a different route into the hills, one less visible from the main road. Megan met him at the gate. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "They'll expect me to stay close," Jack replied. "Lawyers, deputies, insurance investigators, that's predictable. And disappearing isn't?" Jack glanced toward the ridgeline above the river. "Disappearing is control." Megan hesitated. "If you need anything, I'll reach out." Atlas moved between them, brushing briefly against Megan's leg before stepping back into position beside Jack. She smiled faintly. "He doesn't like goodbyes." "Neither do I," Jack said. Then they were moving. The mountain trail rose sharply behind the ranch properties, winding into pine forest that grew thicker with elevation. Snow deepened underfoot, muffling sound. Jack kept a steady pace. Atlas stayed close now, no longer ranging ahead like he once did on open ranch land. The dog's focus had shifted, guarding, watching behind as much as ahead. By afternoon, they reached a narrow clearing overlooking the valley. From here, Jack could see the river cutting through the snow and faintly, the dark outline of the burned barn. He set up a small camp beneath thick tree cover, careful to leave minimal sign of disturbance. Atlas circled once before settling near the edge of the clearing, facing downhill. Jack sat against a fallen log and pulled out the laptop. He worked methodically. Transfers, estate documents, insurance policies. The pattern grew clearer the longer he stared at it. His father's accounts had been consolidated into joint holdings shortly before his health declined. Caroline's name had appeared quietly beside his in several filings. Then, 3 weeks before hospitalization, large insurance policies were taken out. Jack's breathing slowed. He clicked open another file. Land transfers in neighboring counties. 2 other ranchers, both elderly, had transferred holdings under Whitmore's counsel in the past 5 years. Both died within months of the transfer. Natural causes. Jack leaned back and closed his eyes. Atlas shifted and moved closer, sensing the change. The memories came again, this time not of combat, but of his father sitting at the kitchen table years ago, staring out the window as cattle moved slowly across the pasture. "Paper can be sharper than any knife," his father had once said. "You just have to know who's holding it." Jack opened his eyes. "This wasn't greed," he murmured. "It was system." Atlas nudged his hand. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ear. "I'm not angry," he said quietly. "That's the strange part." The anger had burned hot in the chamber beneath the barn. Now it had cooled into something harder. Resolve. That night, sleep came in pieces. The forest was quiet except for distant wind and the occasional crack of snow sliding from branches. Jack woke twice from shallow dreams. The second time, he sat upright abruptly, breath tight, heart racing. Atlas was already there. The dog placed his front paws gently against Jack's chest and leaned his weight forward. Jack closed his eyes and focused on the pressure. Solid. Real. He counted breaths. 1, 2, 3. The panic receded. Still here, Jack whispered. Atlas lowered himself beside him, but did not sleep. On the second day, Jack moved camp slightly farther up the ridge, leaving minimal tracks. He chose vantage points that allowed him to see access roads below without being seen. He watched a black SUV pass twice along the lower valley road. Doyle. Not searching randomly, circling. Jack smiled faintly. "They're uneasy," he said. Atlas's ears twitched at the sound of distant engine noise. Jack closed the laptop and tucked it away. "They think pressure will flush me out." Atlas stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, scanning downhill. Jack followed his line of sight. Nothing moved. Yet Atlas remained fixed on one direction. Jack trusted that. He packed up camp again and shifted locations before dusk. On the third night, Jack sat near a small, concealed fire, just enough warmth to cut the edge of the cold. He played the recording of his father again, but this time listened not to the words, but to the pauses, the hesitation before certain phrases, the stress in his breathing. Thomas Mercer had known something was wrong, but had not been able to confront it openly. Jack stared into the embers. "They relied on isolation," he said softly, "on making people feel alone." Atlas rested his head against Jack's knee. "You and I don't do alone." Snow began to fall lightly again. Jack felt something settle inside him. The initial humiliation was gone. The shock of fire had passed. Now there was clarity. He would not confront Caroline impulsively. He would not accuse Whitmore without structure. He would dismantle them the same way he had dismantled enemy networks overseas, quietly, layer by layer. By the morning of the fourth day, he was ready. He stood at the ridge and looked down over the valley one last time. Smoke no longer rose from the burned barn. Life appeared normal again. But underneath that surface, the system Carolyn and Whitmore had built was fragile. Jack adjusted the straps on his pack. Atlas moved into position at his side. "Time to step back into town," Jack said. Atlas gave a low huff. They began their descent. Jack Mercer had disappeared for 3 days, not because he was hiding, but because he needed to return sharper than when he left. And when he walked back into Bitterroot Valley, it would not be as a grieving son or a displaced veteran. It would be as a man who understood the pattern and intended to break it. Jack came down from the ridge at first light, boots cutting a deliberate path through crusted snow. The valley opened before him, quiet ranch roads, fence lines stitched across white fields, the Bitterroot River glinting cold beneath the bridge. Atlas moved at his side, no longer ranging wide. He stayed close now, body aligned with Jack's pace, head turning occasionally to check the rear. When they reached Megan's property, she was already outside, feeding her horses. She looked up as Jack approached. "You look different," she said. "I am." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Coffee's on." An hour later, Jack sat inside the Bitterroot Valley diner, back to the wall, window to his left. The place smelled of bacon grease and fresh coffee, the air thick with morning chatter from ranchers and truck drivers. Atlas lay under the table, but not fully relaxed. His ears flicked toward every door movement. Megan sat across from Jack, a stack of printed county records spread between them. "I pulled what I could access publicly," she said. "You were right." Jack scanned the pages. 3 estates in the last 5 years, all elderly landowners, all handled by Edgar Whitmore, all transferring majority holdings to a surviving spouse or newly added joint owner, all followed by rapid health decline and death. Megan tapped one of the names. "This one," she said. "Harold Benson, cattle ranch north of here. Died 4 months after changing his will." "Cause of death?" Jack asked. "Cardiac complications." Jack's jaw tightened. Atlas suddenly lifted his head sharply. The bell over the diner door chimed. A black SUV rolled slowly past the front window. Atlas stood under the table, muscles tensing. "Easy," Jack murmured. The SUV slowed, then continued on. Megan followed Jack's gaze. "That him?" "Doyle." Atlas remained standing for several seconds after the vehicle disappeared, eyes fixed on the door. "He doesn't like him," Megan said quietly. "Neither do I." Jack leaned back in the booth. "They're not hiding it anymore," he said. "They want presence. Intimidation." Jack nodded once. "But they're sloppy." Megan frowned. "Sloppy?" "If they were confident," Jack said, tapping the stack of records, "they wouldn't be watching me this closely." He slid one page toward her. "These policies," he said, "they're timed too tightly with the medical changes." "You think Dr. Collins knew?" Megan asked. Jack hesitated. "I think she was pressured." Megan folded her arms. "You going to confront her?" "Not yet." Jack's eyes drifted toward the courthouse square across the street. A brick building with white columns and a small clock tower rising above the roofline. Edgar Whitmore's office sat on the second floor of the adjacent building. The man behind the paper. The man who believed signatures erased suspicion. Jack stood. "Stay here," Megan said quickly. "I'm not doing anything reckless." "That's what you always say." Jack's mouth twitched slightly. "I just want to see him." Whitmore's office smelled of leather and polished wood. Certificates lined the walls, framed legal awards, photographs of charity events and ribbon cuttings. Edgar Whitmore looked up from behind his desk as Jack entered. "Mr. Mercer," he said calmly, "I wasn't aware we had an appointment." Jack remained standing. "We don't." Whitmore folded his hands neatly. "I heard about the unfortunate fire," he said. "Terrible accident." Jack studied him. "You move fast," he said. Whitmore's expression did not change. "I don't follow." "You advised Caroline on restructuring the estate," Jack said evenly. "You oversaw the insurance policies. Legally and transparently. And you've done the same for others." Whitmore leaned back slightly. "I've served this valley for 20 years, he said. "I won't entertain vague accusations." Jack stepped closer to the desk, but kept his tone controlled. "I'm not accusing," he said. "I'm observing." Whitmore's eyes sharpened. "You're grieving," he said. "Grief distorts perspective. Grief doesn't alter bank transfers." Silence settled between them. Atlas stood just inside the doorway, watching Whitmore without blinking. For a brief second, the attorney's gaze flicked toward the dog, then back to Jack. "If you have evidence of wrongdoing," Whitmore said smoothly, "you're welcome to bring it to the authorities." "I will." Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Be careful," he said. "False allegations can damage reputations." Jack met his eyes. "Some reputations need damaging." Whitmore did not respond. Jack turned and walked out. Atlas followed. Outside, the valley felt colder. Megan waited near the diner entrance. "How'd that go?" she asked. He confirmed it. "Confirmed what?" That he's nervous. Atlas stopped suddenly. His body stiffened. He turned his head toward the wooden bridge at the edge of town, the same bridge that crossed the river below the north field. A familiar black SUV sat parked near it, engine running, driver's door open. Travis Doyle leaned casually against the frame, arms folded, watching. Jack felt the shift immediately. "Not here," he murmured. Doyle pushed off the SUV and stepped toward the bridge railing. "Jack," he called out evenly. Jack walked toward him, Atlas at his side. "Fire spreads fast this time of year," Doyle said conversationally. "Dry timber, old structures." "You here to offer fire safety tips?" Jack replied. Doyle smiled faintly. "Just looking out for the community." Atlas let out a low, steady growl. Doyle's eyes flicked to the dog. "That animal's aggressive," he said. "He's accurate." Doyle stepped closer. "You're stirring things up," he said quietly. "People don't like that." Jack held his ground. "I don't care." Doyle's smile faded. "Careful," he said. "Isolation does strange things to people." Jack's eyes hardened. "I've survived worse isolation than this." For a moment, the air between them felt charged. Atlas's posture shifted. Ready. Doyle's hand moved slightly inside his jacket, not drawing anything, just resting. A warning. Jack stepped forward half a pace. "Tell Caroline," he said evenly, "that hiding behind paperwork doesn't protect her." Doyle's jaw tightened. "You think this is about her?" Jack didn't answer. He turned and walked away. Atlas stayed locked on Doyle until distance forced him to look forward again. Megan exhaled slowly once they were clear. "That bridge isn't neutral ground anymore," she said. "No," Jack replied. "It's a line." He looked back once. Doyle still stood there, watching. But something had changed. The intimidation had been met. And now it would escalate. Atlas pressed against Jack's leg again as they reached the diner parking lot. Jack rested his hand on the dog's shoulder. "They're tightening," he said softly. Atlas's ears tilted forward. Jack's gaze drifted toward the courthouse clock tower. "If they push," he said quietly, "they're going to make a mistake. And when they did, he would be ready." The call came just after dark. Jack was back at Megan's bunkhouse, reviewing the financial transfers again under the warm glow of a single lamp. Atlas lay near the door, head up, ears turning at every passing truck on the county road. His phone buzzed once on the table. Unknown number. Jack stared at it for a moment before answering. "Yeah." A pause. Then Travis Doyle's voice, calm and low. "You've been busy." Jack said nothing. "You want to talk?" Doyle continued. "Meet me at the old wooden bridge outside town. Midnight." "That's not neutral ground," Jack replied. A faint chuckle. "Nothing is." The line went dead. Atlas was already standing. Jack slipped the phone into his pocket. "They're pushing," he murmured. Atlas moved closer, tail low but steady. Megan stepped into the doorway from the main house, pulling on a jacket. "You're not going," she said immediately. "I am. That's exactly what they want." Jack met her gaze. "I won't walk in blind." She hesitated. "At least let me call someone." "No," Jack said gently. "Too many uniforms makes this louder than it needs to be." Megan looked at Atlas. "Bring him back," she whispered. Jack nodded once. The bridge sat a mile north of town, older than the steel crossing near the ranch. It was narrow, built from heavy timber beams and iron bolts darkened by decades of river mist. The moon hung low behind thin clouds, casting silver across the water. Jack approached on foot, Atlas at heel. Snow crunched under their boots. Halfway across the bridge, a figure stepped out from the shadow of a support post. Travis Doyle. No SUV this time. Just him. "You came alone," Doyle said. "Did you?" Doyle's eyes flicked briefly toward the tree line. Two shapes shifted in the darkness, not close enough to be seen clearly, close enough to matter. Atlas stiffened. Jack felt it instantly. "They don't trust you," Jack said. Doyle smiled faintly. "They don't trust anyone." The river moved steadily beneath them, dark and indifferent. "You've made this personal," Doyle continued. "That was your mistake." "No," Jack replied calmly. "Burning the barn was yours." Doyle's jaw tightened. "You were supposed to walk away." "I don't walk away from patterns," Jack said. Doyle stepped closer. "This valley works a certain way," he said. "Paperwork, quiet transfers, people minding their business. And when they don't?" Doyle's expression hardened. "They regret it." Atlas's low growl filled the space between them. Doyle's hand moved toward his jacket. Not fast, deliberate. Jack's body shifted subtly into defensive posture. "You don't want to do that," Jack said evenly. Doyle's hand came out holding a knife, small, utilitarian, blade catching moonlight. Not a gun. Intimidation. "Stand down," Doyle said. Jack didn't move. Last chance. The air tightened. Atlas's muscles coiled. Jack spoke softly. "Atlas." The command wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was permission. Doyle lunged. Atlas launched. The movement was a blur of controlled power. He struck Doyle at chest height, knocking him sideways against the railing. The knife clattered across the wooden planks. One of the shadows in the tree line moved forward abruptly. Jack pivoted, ready, but Atlas was already repositioning. Doyle swung his arm reflexively, and the blade grazed Atlas's shoulder before skidding away. Atlas did not retreat. He held Doyle down, teeth locked onto fabric, not flesh. Controlled, trained. Jack stepped in, disarmed Doyle fully, and kicked the knife out of reach. "Enough!" Jack barked. The word carried command. Atlas released immediately, but stayed pressed against Doyle's chest, growling. The two figures in the trees hesitated. Jack met their gaze in the darkness. "Walk away," he said calmly. There was something in his tone that made them listen. They retreated. Doyle lay pinned, breathing hard. "You don't understand," he hissed. "You're opening something you can't close." Jack stepped back slightly, giving Atlas space but not removing him. "I already opened it," Jack replied. He looked down at the dark patch spreading across Atlas's shoulder. Blood. Controlled, but real. Jack's expression shifted. Not to rage, to something colder. "You don't get to hurt him," he said quietly. Doyle swallowed. "You think Whitmore's the only one involved?" he said. "You're stepping into something bigger than a ranch dispute. Then maybe it needs stepping into." Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Someone had called. Doyle's eyes widened slightly. "You called them?" "No," Jack replied. Megan's pickup headlights appeared at the far end of the road. Doyle twisted under Atlas's weight, trying to free himself. Jack stepped back and whistled softly. Atlas disengaged instantly and returned to Jack's side, though his posture remained ready. Doyle scrambled to his feet and staggered toward the shadows without another word. The night swallowed him. Megan reached them seconds later, breath visible in sharp bursts. What happened? Jack knelt beside Atlas. The cut was shallow but long, slicing through fur and into skin. Atlas stood still, eyes on Jack. No whine, no flinch. You're okay, Jack murmured. Megan dropped to her knees and pulled a small medical kit from her truck. Hold him steady. I don't need to hold him, Jack replied. He rested his hand gently against Atlas's neck. The dog didn't move as Megan cleaned the wound. The river continued flowing beneath the bridge. The moon slid behind thicker clouds. You could have escalated, Megan said quietly while wrapping the bandage. You had the upper hand. I'm not here to end people, Jack replied. He looked at Atlas. I'm here to end this. Atlas leaned lightly into his chest once the bandage was secure. Jack stood slowly. The confrontation had shifted something, not just between him and Doyle. Inside him, he had been pushed, provoked, and he had chosen restraint. The valley wasn't a battlefield. It was home. Megan looked at him carefully. They won't stop. I know. Jack glanced down at Atlas. They already made their mistake. The blood on the bridge wasn't fatal, but it was visible, and it marked a line that couldn't be erased. As they walked back toward Megan's truck, snow began to fall again, soft, steady, covering the dark stain on the planks. But it didn't erase what had happened. It only hid it. And Jack Mercer had no intention of letting it stay hidden. The snow fell steadily through the night, covering the wooden bridge in a clean white sheet by morning. The faint trace of blood was gone, swallowed by winter as if it had never been there. But Atlas's shoulder told the truth. Jack sat beside him on the bunkhouse floor, while Megan carefully removed the temporary wrap and replaced it with fresh gauze. The cut was long but shallow, missing muscle and bone by inches. You were lucky, Megan said quietly. Atlas didn't flinch. Jack ran his thumb gently along the dog's neck, careful not to disturb the bandage. Not luck, he said softly. Training. Megan glanced at him. And loyalty. Jack nodded. Atlas lifted his head and locked eyes with him. There was no fear there, no resentment, just the steady certainty of a partner who had stepped in without hesitation. Jack felt the shift again. Not anger now, not urgency. Clarity. Doyle had escalated. Whitmore had underestimated him. Caroline had assumed paperwork was permanent, but his father had built redundancy. Jack stood slowly. I need to go back, he said. To the barn? Megan asked. There's nothing left of the barn. He paused. To the irrigation field. The north field looked different under fresh snow. The blackened skeleton of the barn still stood in places, jagged beams reaching upward like broken fingers. Fire crews had left caution tape along the perimeter, though no one was guarding it. Jack parked at the edge of the field and stepped out. Atlas limped slightly at first, but quickly adjusted, moving beside Jack with quiet determination. You don't have to prove anything, Jack murmured. Atlas's ears tilted, but he didn't slow. They walked past the charred remains and toward the old pump housing near the far fence line, a squat metal structure that once controlled water flow into the irrigation channels. Jack stopped. Atlas had already shifted direction. Instead of following the old barn path, the dog veered toward the pump housing and began sniffing along its base. Jack frowned. That hasn't worked in years, he said. Atlas scratched once at the lower panel, then again, more insistently. Jack stepped closer. The pump housing was rusted, paint peeling away in long strips. Snow clung to its corners. Atlas pressed his nose against a narrow seam near the back. Jack crouched and brushed snow away with his glove. There, beneath rust and chipped paint, was a thin metal latch, hidden in plain sight. "You've got to be kidding me," Jack muttered. He pulled the latch. The panel swung open with a stiff creak. Inside was a waterproof tube secured against the inner wall. Jack carefully removed it. Atlas sat down immediately, watching. Jack unscrewed the cap. Inside lay a folded document sealed in plastic. His pulse quickened, not from fear this time, from hope. He opened it carefully. The header read, "Addendum to the Last Will and Testament of Thomas Mercer." Jack's breath caught. The document was notarized, signed, dated 6 months before his father's death. He read quickly. "If evidence of fraud, coercion, or unlawful medical interference is discovered relating to the estate transfer, all primary assets revert to my son, Jack Mercer, in full." Jack closed his eyes briefly. His father had anticipated this, had known the system could be manipulated, and had trusted only one thing to safeguard the final defense: the land, and the instinct of the dog who would find it. Atlas nudged his arm gently. Jack exhaled slowly. "You hid it in the one place they wouldn't look," he said quietly. The pump housing. Dead ground. Useless irrigation equipment. No lawyer would waste time on it. No insurance investigator would bother. But Atlas had felt it. Not by instruction, by presence. Jack folded the document carefully and slipped it inside his jacket. Snow continued to fall lightly, coating the charred barn remains behind them. The field felt different now. Not haunted. Not violated. Protected. Jack stood and scanned the valley. The ranch house across the river stood quiet and warm. Caroline likely believed the estate was sealed. Whitmore likely believed the confrontation at the bridge had been intimidation enough. Doyle likely believed violence would discourage further digging. They were wrong. Jack looked down at Atlas. "You carried me out of a tunnel," he said softly. "Now you carried this." Atlas's tail swept once through the snow. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered. "Yes." Megan's voice came through, tense but controlled. "County clerk just called me," she said. "Whitmore filed an emergency motion this morning." "For what?" "To finalize liquidation of certain assets before dispute can be raised." Jack smiled faintly. "Too late." "You found something?" "Yes." There was silence on the other end. "Bring it," Megan said. Back at the bunkhouse, Jack laid the notarized addendum on the table. Megan read it slowly. Her eyes widened. "This changes everything," she whispered. "It changes leverage," Jack corrected. She looked up at him. "You're taking this to court?" "Yes." "And Whitmore?" "He'll fight." "And Caroline?" Jack paused. "She'll crack." Atlas shifted on the floor, adjusting his bandaged shoulder. Jack knelt beside him. "I won't let them bury it," he said quietly. Atlas rested his head against Jack's knee. The emotional arc had shifted again. The humiliation was gone. The danger had passed, temporarily. Now there was something stronger. Proof. But beneath it lay a new tension. Because once he filed this addendum, the conflict would leave the shadows. It would move into the open. Courtrooms, public scrutiny, and systems that preferred quiet resolutions. Jack stood. "Tomorrow," he said. "We file." Atlas rose slowly, steady despite the bandage. Outside, the snow had stopped. The valley lay still under a pale winter sky. For the first time since the porch reading, Jack felt something unfamiliar rise beneath his calm. Not anger, not vengeance. Hope. It surprised Jack more than anything else. As he stood on the courthouse steps the following morning, the sky a clear winter blue above Bitterroot Valley, he expected to feel anger, or anxiety, or the sharp edge of confrontation. Instead, there was stillness. Atlas stood at his side, bandaged shoulder visible beneath his thick coat, eyes calm and steady. A few townspeople lingered near the square, pretending not to stare. News traveled fast in small valleys. The burned barn, the midnight confrontation, the emergency filing, and now, this. Megan walked up beside him carrying a leather folder. "Clerk confirmed the addendum is valid on its face, monsieur," she said quietly. "Notarized properly. Recorded copy never submitted, but that doesn't invalidate it." "Whitmore will argue concealment," Jack replied. "Let him." Inside the courtroom, the air felt warmer but heavier. Wood-paneled walls, long benches polished by decades of use. The county flag hanging beside the American flag behind the judge's bench. Caroline sat at the defense table, dressed in dark navy, posture flawless as ever. Edgar Whitmore beside her, expression composed. Travis Doyle stood near the back wall, arms folded, eyes unreadable. Jack took his seat across the aisle. Atlas lay down at his feet. The judge, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice, entered promptly. "This hearing concerns an emergency motion to liquidate estate assets pending potential dispute," she began. "And a counter-filing presented this morning." Whitmore stood. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the estate was legally transferred in full compliance with the will executed by Thomas Mercer. The petitioner's sudden presentation of a previously undisclosed addendum raises serious procedural concerns." Jack rose slowly. "Your Honor," he said, voice even, "the addendum was concealed intentionally to protect the estate in the event of fraud." A ripple of murmurs moved through the courtroom. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Speculation," he said quickly. "The decedent was under medical supervision." Jack placed the flash drive on the evidence table. "With permission," he said calmly. The judge nodded. The clerk inserted the drive into the courtroom system. Audio filled the room. Caroline's voice, sharp, impatient. "We don't have another year." Whitmore's voice followed. "Adjustments need to be accelerated." The courtroom went silent. Caroline's composure flickered. "That recording was obtained illegally," Whitmore snapped. "It was recorded by Thomas Mercer in his own home," Jack replied. The judge raised a hand. "Proceed carefully, Mr. Whitmore." Jack stepped forward. "These are medical records showing rapid dosage changes inconsistent with prior treatment," he said. "These are insurance policies initiated weeks before hospitalization. These are estate transfers tied to similar patterns in neighboring counties." He paused. "And this is the addendum my father executed when he realized something was wrong." Megan handed the notarized document to the clerk. The judge read carefully. Across the aisle, Caroline's fingers tightened slightly around her pen. Whitmore leaned in and whispered to her. She didn't look at him. "Dr. Avery Collins is present?" the judge asked. A woman in her mid-40s stood slowly from the second row. She looked tired, guilty. "Yes, Your Honor." "You treated Thomas Mercer during his final year?" "Yes." "Were medication changes made under external pressure?" The question hung heavy. Whitmore stood immediately. "Objection." "Overruled," the judge replied. Dr. Collins swallowed. Yes, she said quietly. A gasp rippled through the room. I was told adjustments were necessary for estate planning clarity, she continued. I was told it was temporary. Caroline's composure cracked for the first time. That's not true, she said sharply. Dr. Collins shook her head. I should have questioned it sooner. Silence returned, thick and absolute. Atlas lifted his head slowly. He turned toward Caroline. Their eyes met. The dog did not growl, did not move. He simply watched. Caroline's gaze faltered. For the first time since the porch reading, she looked uncertain. Whitmore stood abruptly. Your Honor, these allegations are substantial, the judge interrupted, and this addendum, if valid, halts liquidation immediately. She looked toward Jack. Mr. Mercer, you're aware this will initiate a broader investigation? Yes, ma'am. Very well. She struck the gavel once. Liquidation is stayed. The addendum will be reviewed for enforcement. The court will appoint independent auditors regarding estate handling. Whitmore sat down slowly. Caroline remained upright, but pale. Doyle shifted uncomfortably near the wall. The momentum had changed. Not violently, quietly, controlled. Jack felt no surge of triumph, only release. He looked down at Atlas. Good work, he murmured. Atlas's tail thumped softly against the courtroom floor. Outside, the winter sun reflected off fresh snow as townspeople spilled onto the courthouse steps. Megan exhaled deeply beside him. You did it. Jack shook his head slightly. We started it. Across the square, Whitmore exited quickly, head low. Caroline followed a moment later, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Doyle lingered, then disappeared toward his SUV without a word. Jack stood on the steps and looked out over Bitterroot Valley. The fight wasn't finished. There would be audits, statements, evidence reviews. But the silence had broken. The system had been exposed to light. And for the first time since his father's voice crackled through that underground chamber, Jack felt something steady and undeniable. Not just hope, justice. The word settled differently in Jack's chest than anger ever had. Winter loosened its grip slowly over the following months. Snow receded from the Bitterroot Valley in uneven patches, revealing dark soil and the first thin blades of spring grass pushing through. The investigation moved forward quietly but steadily. Independent auditors combed through estate filings. Insurance carriers reviewed accelerated policies. County officials reopened 2 prior cases connected to Whitmore's office. Edgar Whitmore resigned before formal charges were announced. Caroline Mercer withdrew from public life, her composure unraveling in depositions that stretched long into gray afternoons. Travis Doyle's contract work in the valley ended abruptly. No dramatic arrests, no public spectacle, just consequences arriving one document at a time. Jack did not attend most of it. He was busy rebuilding. The burned barn was cleared by early March. The charred beams hauled away, the ground leveled. In its place, Jack began constructing something different. Not storage, not cattle housing. A training structure, open floor space, reinforced beams, wide doors that allowed mountain air to flow through. Megan stood beside him one afternoon, hands on her hips, watching the frame rise. You could have rebuilt exactly what was there, she said. I know, but you didn't. Jack wiped sweat from his brow and looked out across the field. I don't need a barn, he said. I need purpose. Atlas trotted across the packed dirt, shoulder scar now healed into a thin, pale line beneath his fur. He moved confidently, strength fully returned, though he stayed close to Jack more often than before. The scar didn't slow him, it marked him. Jack knelt and ran his hand along it gently. "You earned that," he murmured. Atlas leaned into him. Word spread quietly among local veterans that Jack Mercer was opening space on the North Field for something new. K-9 assisted therapy sessions for former service members adjusting to civilian life. Nothing flashy, just open land, mountain air, and dogs trained to ground what memories tried to unmoor. The first session happened on a cool April morning. 3 men stood awkwardly near the new structure, hands shoved in jacket pockets, eyes scanning the horizon more than each other. Atlas approached slowly, tail neutral, posture calm. He didn't rush. He didn't bark. He simply existed. One of the men, a former Army medic, knelt without thinking when Atlas stopped in front of him. The dog rested his head lightly against the man's knee. No words were needed. Jack watched from a short distance. He understood that silence, understood what it meant when breath steadied because something steady leaned against you. That afternoon, Jack climbed the ridge above the North Field. Atlas followed without command. The valley stretched wide below them, cattle moving like dark punctuation marks across green pasture, the river glinting under fresh sunlight, the rebuilt structure standing solid where ashes once lay. The ranch house across the river looked smaller somehow, less imposing. Jack sat on a flat rock overlooking everything his father had once tended. Wind moved softly through the pine trees. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. Not for threats, not for sirens, not for footsteps in snow. Just wind. Atlas settled beside him. "You knew," Jack said quietly, speaking as if his father were sitting somewhere nearby. "You knew I'd have to fight for it." He looked down at the valley. "But you didn't leave me a fight." He reached over and rested his hand on Atlas's back. "You left me a direction." Atlas's ears flicked at the sound of distant laughter drifting up from the field below. Veterans helping Megan adjust fencing near the new training area. Community. Light where there had been smoke. Jack inhaled deeply. The tightness that had once lived constantly in his chest, the edge of vigilance, the readiness to react, had softened. Not vanished, but softened. The humiliation on the porch felt distant now. The fire under the barn, the knife on the bridge, the courtroom silence, all part of something larger. Loss had not ended him. It had refined him. Atlas stood suddenly and walked a few steps forward, scanning the horizon as he had done 1,000 times before in different landscapes. Jack watched him. "Still on watch," he said softly. Atlas glanced back. "Always." Jack rose and stepped beside him at the edge of the ridge. The Bitterroot Valley spread below like a living map of everything that had been tested and restored. Sunlight broke fully through the thinning clouds, washing the mountains in warm gold. Jack felt no need for words beyond that. Justice had come quietly. Purpose had come stronger. And loyalty, unwavering, unspoken, had carried him through both. He crouched and wrapped one arm around Atlas's neck, pulling him close for a brief moment. "Ready to go back down?" he asked. Atlas's tail moved once. Together, they turned from the ridge and began the descent toward the field, toward the structure rising from once burned ground. Behind them, the mountains stood steady. Ahead of them, men and dogs waited in open sunlight. And in the quiet rhythm of boots on earth and paws in grass, the legacy Thomas Mercer had feared losing was no longer in danger. It was alive, stronger than before. If you believe a man should never be pushed off his own land without a fight, Type justice in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand your ground when it mattered most, share where you're watching from. Subscribe and stay with us for more true-to-heart stories about loyalty, dignity, and holding the line in the land of the free.